Okay, I'm going to do a quick sound check. All right, I think we should be good now. Okay, very good. All right. So I just mentioned we're going to talk a little bit about mental health at work and how to change that conversation and basically end the stigma that mental health is something that can't be talked about, and that mental health is a part of our overall health because mysteriously enough, our brain is a part of our body. So it is really talking about total health. But first, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kelly Palanti. I am the CEO and founder of Mentally Fit Workplaces. I focus on mental health safety management consulting. I also do learning and development workshops and seminars for leaders and all staff. So separate that just focus on leaders and people managers and how to support people. And then I do one that's really to give employee resilience skills to all the staff at an organization. And then well-being programs. So this goes a little bit beyond our traditional employee assistance programs, like the meditation apps or maybe a limited amount of counseling sessions. This is actually doing a deep down and working on focus groups, one-on-one interviews, and understanding what employees actually need. So not just around their personal resilience, but what things at work do they need to have better mental health, whether that's better communication, whether that's more flexibility at work, what do they basically need? So it's really doing something that we talk about in HR right now and simply asking. I am one of the new certifications that's come up recently with SHRM is the SHRM offers a workplace mental health ally certification. This was, I thought, a really good course. It talks about what you can do as the HR person in an organization, how you can advance mental health, but also gives you some of the resources that are offered in the mental health first aid course. So I'm also mental health first aid certified, and that gives you an opportunity to basically do an assessment with people. So if you see someone who may be expressing signs of depression, of suicide ideation, it gives you the tools to help that person. So the Workplace Mental Health Ally certification kind of does both of those. It talks about the HR and then a little bit of the mental first aid, like how do you actually care for a person who's in mental distress. All right. So I'm going to start off and tell you my story, why I'm here, what is making me talk about mental health and really dedicate my whole consulting practice now to that. I will just start off to say that prior to pandemic, I was a typical happy HR pro. I did management consulting for many years. And then once in a while, I would get a client that would talk me into going internal. And that happened right before the pandemic. So before the pandemic, I was doing consulting. And then I had a client that asked me to come in and sit in the HR director seat. And so I did that. And it was 3 months before pandemic set in. So just at the first of the year, I had all my strategic goals and plans in place and so many exciting things that we were going to do for the company. And then, of course, everything kind of changed rather quickly. I remember all of us, maybe you do too, of just kind of sitting around in that room and saying, are we coming to, it was a Friday specifically, are we coming to work on Monday? And then how much we really changed. So the pandemic changed the way we, focus on, HR and how we basically interact with people. Because during the pandemic, many of us experienced mental health safety overload, which then led to burnout. So in the HR seat, not only were we For instance, my organization was laying off people, so we were taking health insurance away from employees at a time when we were still washing groceries. So I had so many employees, crying on the phone, like, what is COBRA? How does this work with my insurance? What does this mean for us? Are we going to ever come back to work? So not only was it, of course, mentally distressing for me, but also the managers that I had to train to have those conversations and the employees. And then number two, because we did primarily work remote, prior I was in the office. I sat in the C-suite hallway like many HR folks do, next to the COO. But when I went remote, I was available all the time. People had access to me through chat, and they didn't have to walk past the CEO or the COO's office to get to me and have a conversation about mental health. So I found that I had such an overwhelming reach to me too. Prior to that, maybe in your career, you would have, depending on the organization, maybe 1 to 10 people ask about mental health services. It was 1 to 10 a week, and it just seemed to grow as the pandemic, went on. So myself, it really led to a lot of burnout and really change the way my career and my career focus is now. So that really led me to what I'm doing today, which is mental health at work consulting work. This is I'm going to say a pioneer industry for the US, but not globally. I've learned a lot about how to really approach this in a safety risk management perspective, not just in supporting the employees, but what can the companies do to reduce mental harm? And that's really been influenced by consultants I work with in Canada, where this is mandated. So organizations have to have a mental health safety policy, just like we follow our OSHA policies here in the US. So they've got to have policies, they have to have roles, there has to be measurements in place. There has to be a certain amount of resources available for employees. And Australia is starting to do this as well. So mental health is really kind of taking a step up and being on more of an equal format with physical health. And I'm hope that what my work does is really kind of shine a light on that and really bring us up to that standard after the pandemic. So before we go into how we do this, let's talk about why. So the topic of the presentation is how do we talk about mental health at work? And so we're going to get into that. But first of all, why would we do that? What would be the reason that, like say, we've never talked about this before? It's always been kind of taboo and a stigma. So why now are we changing? And a lot of that has to do with, I think, a realization of what our effects are after the pandemic. We've been told that 1 in 5 U.S. adults report the pandemic had a serious impact on their mental health. So not that mental health didn't exist before, it's just really kind of shined a light on it. And I think give people a more opportunity to reflect too. Like, am I experiencing anxiety? Oh, is that what this is? Am I experiencing depression? And really kind of understanding those symptoms. Speaking of, depression interferes with a person's ability to complete a physical job about 20% of the time. So if you think about even times in your own life, because every human being has experienced depression, how is depression presented for you? Does it mean that you're unable to focus? Some people aren't able to move. They have to stay in one spot or even be in bed. So depression has a direct impact on how we perform. And then it also reduces our cognitive performance. And CDC tells us that's about 35% of the time. So not only does depression really reduce our productivity, but when we are producing, so when we're in that mode, we're really not able to focus. We're not able to have a clear mind and to make clear decisions and really be able to see things in a sometimes in an introspective way, because we're almost like clouded. That's what depression, can do. So these are ways that it's really interfering with the workplace. And then here's what's really important. 47% of employees who know about their company's mental health services, only 38% utilize them. So first of all, number one, that 47% number is very low, right? So that means that less than half employees at an organization that actually has some mental health services, whether that's counseling, the meditation apps, some kind of workshops, learning and development, many people don't even know about those. So number one, we've got to really bring forward that information and then also teach people how to utilize them and let them know that it's okay to do so and that it's safe to do so. So I want to talk about, when we think about how does that impact, work and how does that impact the organization? So why should we talk about mental health? Why is mental health of employees important? And, from my perspective, because we've been through pandemic, and because I am really focused on diversity, inclusion, and belonging, to me, there really shouldn't need to be a business case for this, right? Because we know that people need total care and total help. We know that the Great Resignation has resulted in people looking for organizations that care. They're looking for empathetic leaders. So to me, the case is out there. It's already being made, but there are some actual bottom line financial costs. And I think it's important to take a look at those too. So you can see from my iceberg here, we've got the visible costs. And that could be healthcare costs, right? Those are direct costs. So again, the mind is a part of the body. And as we know, the mind has direct implications on how our body feels sometimes, right? It could have an implication on our cardiovascular health, on our digestive health, just to name a few. And of course, all of those things are going to increase medical claims. So if you're taking care of mental health, you're actually able to reduce your physical health claims. And this is proven and can be tracked. So this is one of the things that I do with organizations is I look at the benefit analysis. What are they using now? What kind of claims are being made? And then when we insert a mental health safety program, we adopt these new policies, these new strategies. How do the healthcare costs look, at the end of the year or at next year, and start comparing those. One of the reasons why I think this is key to focus on too of the why is that healthcare is going up pretty significantly, not just because of its tie to mental health, but it is a result of the pandemic. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, many people with chronic illnesses or illnesses that became chronic during the pandemic did not get help or did not get treatment. So a lot of those kind of came into the system at one time. So I've been told by brokers that many organizations may see an increase from 20 to 22% in their premium costs. So from that perspective, organizations really need to take a look at other ways that they're going to be able to reduce that. They can't change what's happened with the pandemic. They can't change what's already going on now. But how can they change that for the future? What can they do? What do they have control of? So medical is one of those. And then, of course, that goes, hand in hand with pharmaceutical. Again, if your mental health is affecting, how you perform, it's affecting your heart, that all increases pharmaceuticals as well. So those are the visible costs. That's what we can see inside the organization. Now we're going to talk about the non-visible costs, right? The loss of productivity, things that we really can't see and that are sometimes hard to put a dollar amount on. So number one is absenteeism. So when a person isn't feeling mentally well, again, that can result in them feeling not physically well. So they're absent, right? They will call off more off work. And a lot of times organizations won't know why. Many people won't call into a company and say, I'm going to take a mental health day today. They will in fact lie. They will say, I have a stomach ache today. I have a headache. I have a migraine, which may be true and maybe a part of, a symptom of the mental health. But it really is, again, a causal effect there. So absenteeism is one. presenteeism. If you're not familiar with this term, this has been a big term lately, talked about a big in the HR space, also in the mental health space. And the best way I can describe it is really somebody sitting at their computer and just kind of typing away very slowly, not engaging a lot in the work. So they're there at the work. Let's say if they were at the office, they're in their seat, they're at the computer, but they're not producing work, right? They're maybe scrolling social, they're maybe staring off into space. So they're present at work. So they're getting that paycheck, they're getting checked off, but they're not being productive at work. So there's a lot of lost indirect costs there. Short-term and then also long-term disability. A lot of times, again, these are connected directly to the healthcare claims, and we can see that those costs will significantly go down if mental health safety is taken into account. So again, really focusing on those, and then workers' comp claims as well. So the cost of distress, they call these mentally distressed workers. I'm going to give some quick numbers, and then we're going to go into the meat and potatoes of the how here. So to focus one last thing on the cost of like why do we need to talk about this at work? Because mentally distressed workers cost employers over $2,800 a year more in healthcare services. So that's just an estimate based on the average company in the US. Obviously, that's going to be lower in some areas and significantly higher in other areas. So $2,800 just in the healthcare cost. Each mentally distressed worker costs an employer over $4,700 a year in days of work missed. So there's that number there. Again, a great estimate on absenteeism. So when a person isn't there, you know that productivity is lost. So this is really, a difficult thing sometimes to put a number on, because when someone isn't there, where does the work often go? To another worker, to a colleague, which is increasing their workload and causing more mental distress. And each mentally distressed worker costs an employer over $5,700 a year in turnover. So anyone who's in the HR space, people ops space, know this is what one of our number one metrics is turnover, because of the cost of it. Now, I almost feel like because this is an average number in the US, that $5,700 is pretty low depending on the role. If you've got somebody who's, let's say, an executive role, and they're turning over, let's say they're burned out in the position, that could cost you, $50,000, $60,000 in lost productivity and finding and replacing that person. So there's a lot of things that go into turnover. It's not just the person being gone and waiting for the replacement. It's that lost productivity when they're gone. It's the workload that's being distributed while they're gone to the other workers. And it's the time to be able to not only hire somebody else, but to train them. So this can be anywhere from, I've never seen a 2-week period really on turnover. I would say anywhere minimum from 4 weeks to 6 months, up to a year sometimes, to replace a key role. So very costly to employers. So when we talk about mental health distress, what kind of things does that include? And there's a note here at the top that says it's important to note that individuals may be experiencing more than one type of mental illness. So that's what they call that comorbidity. So more than one type. Common ones that we typically see at the workplace are depression, something that every, human experiences. And we mentioned in the beginning how prevalent not only depression is, but how it impacts us at work. Hold on, I've got a stat coming on that. Okay, an estimated 21 million, that's 8.4% of adults in the United States have had at least one major depressive episode. So 8.4%, so if you think about your workforce in those terms too, think about how often this is happening inside the workplace. Anxiety. Now, this one, anxiety is interesting because it's actually broken up into several categories. So I just took two statistics to share. General anxiety disorder, so just general, affects 6.8 million US adults. That's about 3% of our population, but specifically social anxiety disorder. So I've been seeing this more present in the workplace, particularly since the pandemic, because we have been more isolated and separate, and people who have social anxiety disorder were actually thriving a little bit more in the environment. But now that we are coming back again, full circle coming back, social anxiety is increasing. So we've got about 7% of our population that experiences social anxiety disorder. So again, think about that in terms of people who you work with, who in your team you think is part of this number. Suicidal ideation. This, of course, is extremely serious, and I belong to a lot of HR forums and blogs where HR folks kind of go in there and talk about things that they're dealing with. And I've been not unsurprisingly, but really, I guess, kind of depressingly, seen a lot more cases of HR asking about help with employees who have talked about suicide. Like every time I go on a forum, I can find at least 1 to 3 posts that mention it. And I guess what also is kind of disheartening is that sometimes they're dealing with more than one person. So it's not just an isolated case, like, oh, someone reached out, they said they're gonna, they're thinking about committing, suicide. No, it's several, people at times. So we do have 12.2 million Americans that seriously think about suicide every year. We know that more often than not, it's women who have suicidal ideation, but unfortunately, it's men who often carry that out. So women sometimes will, I think that number is lower because they will actually reach out, but men won't. And so they are taught to be silent, and that is really a stigma that they don't want to be associated with, that they could be weak if they talked about suicide. So that is, I think, really key to think about too, is like, think about how can you affect people in the workplace, but not only that, but people that they interact with. So if you're giving mental health support or safety resources to your employees, just think about how those employees take that knowledge, take that education, and use that in their own life to help their family members and their friends. Substance abuse comorbidity. So this is, yes, you're right. Teenagers is also, I think, one of the key ones. And my really goal here too, I think in the end, when I'm talking about workplace mental health, is making it a place where our young people can come into and feel safe, because we have a whole new generation, like each one that comes in and shapes the way we work. And this generation is definitely doing that. So I think this is almost an opportunity for us to kind of normalize these conversations. Like, it's okay to ask someone who's not doing well mentally, do you feel, like you're thinking about suicide? And then you, as the person who's asking that, do you have the tools then to go with the next step? Like, how do you help that person? And that is really what we focus on in mental health first aid, is how to properly support someone. Okay, so substance abuse disorder. This, of course, comorbidity, it goes along with a lot of other disorders, but again, like many things during the pandemic, has really increased. A lot of it, again, due to our isolation and being home, but substance abuse has always been an issue. This is just, to me, another opportunity to shine a light on it and to give resources and support. Later, our next seminar, Jamie Murphy with Allendale Treatment, is going to talk about what do you do if somebody in your workplace, if you suspect that they are have substance abuse disorder. How do you approach them? What resources do you give? How do you follow up with them? And then once you're doing all that, I think it's also important to think, how do you care for yourself as the person who's providing this support? As Stephanie mentioned in our previous webinar, that setting up boundaries is important, because helping people talk, through anxiety, helping people talk about depressions, suicide. These are very heavy topics. So as the leader, as the HR person, as the people manager, as the CEO, how are you going to, again, after you give the support, take care of yourself? So that's another part of really the overall safety plan. So now we're going to get into the how, right? So how do we do this? So we know the why. We know that there's tons of statistics out there that tell us that it's costing the company money, that there's a lot of people in the US who are experiencing this. So if you have one of these issues, if you have depression, anxiety, how do you talk about that at work? And I know I said I'm getting into the meat potatoes. I'm going to still ask one more question. And the question is, do you work in a psychologically safe workplace? And what I mean by that is, do you work in a place where you feel that you can speak your mind, that you can be honest about what's going on with yourself, and you will not be retaliated against? That is really key when you think about sharing mental health concerns, because number one, you have to you're being vulnerable, right? You're giving some information up about yourself that's personal. And in order to do that, you need to feel psychologically safe. You need to be able to feel like, again, there'll be no retribution to what you're saying. If you're not in that environment, if you're in an environment that you're thinking, well, if I told my manager I was, I needed a day off, for mental health because, I'm having an issue, how would my manager respond? If my manager would scoff at me and say, yeah, get back to work, that's probably not a psychologically, safe environment. If your boss steps back and says, tell me what you need, tell me how I can support you, we'll make sure that you're covered for this day, let us know what you need to continue. Imagine just the person taking off that day when they have those two different scenarios. If you're given basically the safety to take care of yourself, that one day you can come back a day later, 2 days later, a stronger employee. If you ask for that time in an environment that's not safe and you still take the time off, you're going to feel guilty, resentment. There's going to be a lot of things, and you really won't be taking care, right? You're really not going to be recuperating. So it's really key, number one, to have an environment that's safe before you talk about your mental health. And to do that, you really need to find, I hate to call them champions, but they are mental health people who are going to champion this inside the organization. And like most things, it really needs to start with the executives. So how do the executives at your organization, do they talk about mental health? Do they set boundaries? How do they, let's see, what policies do they take in place? There's an organization that I posted about recently. They have in their job ad, so right in the job ad, when it talks about the benefits of the company, mandatory mental health days. So days where you're told to go take care of yourself. So you know that that's coming from, executive leadership. That's telling you that you're in a psychologically safe environment. Obviously, your people managers are a good place to go. Now, people managers, many of them have good intentions, but not necessarily the tools. But I think it's important to start that conversation and ask. And again, if you feel that you can trust your manager, if you feel like you have that safe environment with them, that you're not going to be retaliated against, this is a time to initiate that conversation. DEIB pros. I talk a lot about how diversity and inclusion, and particularly that B part, that belonging, how that really encompasses mental health, right? So be able to be psychologically safe, to be yourself, to be able to come to work and say what you need to be a productive employee means that you have belonging. So there really is a true intersection between diversity and inclusion and belonging in the environment. So DEI pros are another one that are really championing, mental health support inside organizations. Oh, you did awesome. That is awesome, Kimberly. Yes. Safety directors. Now I mentioned, we're really trying to take a new spin on this and look at it from an OSHA type perspective. So right now, our safety directors deal with that, right? They make sure that the organization even has simple things like the cords are not, in the hallway, that there's not, things aren't coming down from the ceiling, right? They make sure the environment is safe. This is the same thing for mental health. What things can we ensure that the environment is safe? So let's just look at it like a risk management piece. What resources or what things can you take away from work to make sure it's safe? So safety directors are another go-to. And then of course I had to save them for last, and that's our HR and people operation pros. And the main reason I kept them for last is number one, two reasons. They can, number one, be the go-to to a lot of people, or the place where people want to run away from most. So I will just give two quick scenarios about that. I had a manager that I worked with. She had an employee that was experiencing a poor mental health problem. She knew the organization had resources to help, but when she directed the person to go to HR to get the resources, the employee said no way. Not mainly because of there's that trust factor, because HR does deal with our performance reviews. It deals with disciplinary actions a lot of times with our compensation. And so people fear that there might be some inherent bias if they go to HR with their issues. So they don't reach out and get their resources. But then on the flip side, HR does have a role in this. So prior to the pandemic, prior to talking, about mental health as part of our regular safety program, you are protected under the ADA with mental health. For instance, in my past, I've had an employee who was having difficulty getting to work on time. He just could not make these certain hours. If his schedule was between the 8 and 10 a.m. hour, he just couldn't get there. And the manager was getting ready to fire him because he was like, I've given him enough chances. I've given him enough warnings. He just is not getting it. He's got to be here during those shifts. He can't be late. And so I sat down with the employee and I just really asked, like, what's going on with you? So you need to do this. Like, what's preventing you from getting to work on time? And it had to do with his actually prescriptions that he was taking for bipolar disorder. And he said, because of the time of day where he takes them, the morning times tend to be a little groggier for him. It takes him a little bit more into late morning to afternoon to get going. And that those early morning shifts were just becoming too difficult. And so I went back to the manager and said, this is an accommodation for him. He has what we call a mental health disorder. So he's seen a physician, he has a prescription, and is he able to do his job if we give him an accommodation? Because there were no other performance issues about actually performing the work. It was just this issue about getting to work during these particular hours. So what we were able to do as an accommodation for this employee was just make sure he worked after 12. It was a simple one. There are other shifts available. We moved some things around. We talked with other employees to move shifts around to see if we can get things available. Of course, keeping his situation confidential. But in the end, we kept that employee, and that employee is still with the organization and thriving. And we could have easily dismissed them because we could have said they didn't make it, they didn't get here on time, and just, that's it. We have a zero tolerance policy for that. So I think what's important, if you're going to talk and seek out these mental health champions, is really ask. Because I think a lot of people feel like the organization should be the one to bring it up, that maybe they've dropped hints that, hey, we should be talking about mental health more. Maybe they mentioned that in a meeting. It really needs to be a direct ask, because in the end, employees and people who work for organizations are almost like the consumers of that organization. If there's a total reward or something that they want, they just really have got to ask. And if enough people ask and bring this to the attention, then that really, really kind of gets the conversation and moving forward. So what do you want to ask then? So let's say like you're not in a psychologically safe environment. You don't want to ask like, what are you going to do for my depression? How else can you start, and how else can you talk about mental health at work? Ask the question to your manager, to your HR pro, to your DEIB pro. What is mental health? What mental health support do we have? So again, we talked about in the beginning with those stats. Out of 47% of people in a company who even know about the employee assistance program, only 36% know to use it. So that number is low. So just even telling people like, hey, what do we have available right now? And that also will help assess where the gaps are from what people are asking. Excuse me. Do our people managers receive training on how to support employee mental health? So again, you're not going and you're not, let's say, going to an executive who you know sets boundaries, who you know takes this a priority, and you're not saying, hey, my manager stinks at supporting my mental health. You're saying, what tools does my manager have? And what are you doing to make sure that they're supporting employee mental health? Again, bringing that conversation up and out there. How is mental health covered under the ADA? So this goes back to what I just mentioned in the end about HR, and that mental health disorders are a protected issue under ADA. So they can require accommodations. And as I mentioned already in my example, an accommodation does not need to be an expensive issue. Sometimes it could be something as simple as a time change. Sometimes it can be even what device they use and how they interact with it. So there's a lot of ways that accommodations can be made for mental health, and it doesn't have to be something that's financially burdensome to the organization. And then, does the organization have a mental health safety plan? Yes, you're right, Kim. Yeah, less than 3,000. And there's a great, I'm sure you're familiar with jan.org. There's a great resource out there that really helps companies get the right accommodations for their employees. So you tell them what the issue is, and they will come up with ideas, cost-effective ideas to make that safe. We are really coming into an age where employees are going to talk more and more about this, about accommodations, about how they are going to be the most productive worker. And because we are seeing such high turnover, we're not in what they call an employer market anymore. We can't just throw employees away and get a new one next week. Hiring doesn't work like that anymore. So we've got to invest in the people that are with our organization. I think that's an also key thing here. But does the org have a mental health safety plan? So thinking again about just like physical safety, like what do we have in place? So I want to talk more about what that looks like, because this really drills down to what I do for organizations, and that is to help build mental health safety. So mental health safety is really 3 parts, and it starts with a lot of things when you talk about programming, and that is learning and development. So just as I mentioned there about developing leaders, having leaders lead with empathy. This is, again, one of the number one reasons that the Great Resignation has happened, is that we don't have leaders that are empathetic to employees or even understand how to express empathy. Some people think, well, I'm just not empathetic. That's just not me. That's not my personality. Empathy can be learned. It's more than just feeling sorry for the other person. It's actually trying to understand that we're all individuals and that we all have our own experiences and perspectives that build us and bring us, to the place that we are now, including sometimes trauma that we've experienced in our life. So how to be an empathetic leader, how to build that psychologically safe environment. Communication. So when we think about mental harm at work, communication is one that is really kind of simple, but that does affect and mental. But that does really have a big impact on leadership. So for instance, a lot of leaders have heard this term micromanagement, right? They don't want to be micromanagers. They don't want to be looking over employees all the time. But it actually can go the other way as well. If you have leaders that don't communicate enough, that can leave someone with anxiety. That can leave an employee with lack of role clarity. So that could maybe result in presenteeism. So they know they've got tasks to do, but they're maybe not that clear because they don't have a lot of communication. So really, again, building up that environment. And then mental health, I just want to check in, is the presentation, everything's coming across? Give me a quick, having a thing on my end. Okay, it's frozen. Okay, let me try. 1 second. Technical difficulties in the middle is unusual. Let's try to fix that really quick. Oh, there now. Okay, back again. There we go. Okay, hopefully we're there now. Okay, mental health safety plan. Okay, so communication and then mental health first aid. So that's what I mentioned about be able to recognize if you see depressive disorder in someone, if someone has expressed suicide ideation, what are the tools that you have as a leader to actually get to do the right thing, because I think that's what leaders are shy about right now. When I talk about that, needing mental health safety support resources and tools to help us support employees, a lot of managers are scared of that because they'll say things like, "I'm not a counselor," or I don't want to get into that because I don't know what the rules are to talk about health." And I feel like that's where the education piece comes in, and the mental health first aid is that it's true. You're not a counselor, and you're definitely not expected to be. And your role in that is really important to understand. But what can you do? Ignoring the situation or brushing it off to HR and hope that they follow up is not always going to be the solution. So, what tools do you have in your own pocket that you're going to be able to help this person? And then also, work design analysis. So I talk about this a lot with learning and development because the way we work has changed so much in the past couple of years, not only the remote, the hybrid, the back and forth, but also the teams, again, with communication. Who do we communicate with? When Stephanie mentioned about setting professional boundaries, one of the key solutions of that was to communicate with people in your workplace. So how do you do that? Who's in your work design, that you need to let know when things are happening. So how work is produced and how it is evolved really needs to be something that's focused on when we're talking about mental health. And then we've got employee well-being. And this is probably the area that employers do the best on. They offer EAP programs, which are employee assistance programs. Those are typically, they have all kinds of resources from meditation apps to free gym classes to maybe 6 counseling sessions with a mental health counselor. So they are a great resource. They are definitely a part of a mental health safety plan. The problem is a lot of organizations just depend on that. So they might say, we've got a meditation app, check. We've done mental health at work. We've done something, but it really has to go beyond that. work-life practices. We've been talking a lot about, when we talk about employee well-being, is building resilience so they can do that, so they can set boundaries. So if they are having poor mental health, that they have the resources, tools, and support to get themselves, healthy again, or even take the next step if they need additional support. So employee well-being is something that, is the one piece I would say of mental health safety that's being approached correctly right now, and next to learning and development. But the piece that I really want to enforce more and see more of, and I think this is where employees, again, it's going to create that safe environment, is if we look at it from a risk management perspective. So if we look at the workplace and really assess where it's at right now, how do people communicate? Do they feel safe? And this is a lot of these assessments are done with confidentiality, with unidentifiable information, so that we can get a full picture and there's no fear of retaliation if psychological safety is not present. So we need to look at mental health just like we would assess anything else in the organization. What's going on with it now so that we can make plans for it. We need to identify what we call those psychosocial hazards. So just like we have physical hazards like a brick falling down from a building, what would be a psychosocial hazard at work? That could be work overload. If you've got someone, again, who there's a lot of turnover in the organization and the work is being spread out among a lot of people or being spread to another person, that can cause a hazard. That could cause that person to have mental distress. That could cause them to have absenteeism. So we need to identify those hazards at work and then address them. So if someone's in that hazard, what do they do for support, or how do we change that? Policy development. Now, of course, in HR, we talk a lot about policy, and I think that kind of sometimes people feel like that takes away from maybe the interaction or more the engagement approach to mental health, that we're supporting people. Why do we need a policy behind that? And I would say more for safety and security, and just to know that what's happening with one person in the organization is happening with all, that it's across the board and that it's consistent, and that there's actual action. So a lot of time, again, we'll see this lip service. We used to see it a lot in DEIB, where they would shout from the rooftops or put on their socials, we're doing, National Coming Out Day, and they change their, all the colors in the org, to rainbows that day. But there are no policies. There are nothing to support that diversity and inclusion efforts. So policy really kind of puts the meat and potatoes behind it. And what would a policy look for someone who wants to talk about mental health at work? Well, let's say, who would you go to? What are the resources? What is the process if you need an accommodation? What is the process if you need an extended leave, for mental health? Knowing where to go and what to do is part of creating that safety at work. And then accountability into roles. So I mentioned, HR was the last on my list over there when we talked about, who to go to, who's going to champion these things. And it just really depends on the role of HR in your organization. How are they perceived? But it is really, in my view, just like we separate the safety director for our physical health, I believe that we should be separating it for our mental health as well. So a mental health safety advisor, a mental health safety director. These are roles that exist in organizations in Canada. They have someone at the organization at Deloitte in Canada who you go to, the mental health safety director, and you don't have to worry about confidentiality. You don't have to worry about retaliation, because there is a role who is accountable and dedicated there for this. So I think that is key. So when there is mental health support at work, so let's say that you're getting all these things into place. Why do you want to do this? And mainly because employees will feel emotionally, physically and mentally healthier, resulting in a workforce that's better, productive, and more innovative. Basically, I always say this is my go-to phrase, is that happy employees are productive employees. So when they have that total support, so just like you wouldn't make somebody with a broken ankle climb up a ladder, why would you make somebody with depression try to do social engagement at work that day? It's really taking someone who's under mental harm and taking that into consideration with accommodations, with policies, with flexibility, anything to give that total support and to create that psychological safety at work. So when we're talking about emotional, physical, mental, that's the total well-being of an employee. And so this is really why you want to do that. And that brings me to my end, and I'm at the 50. Thank you so much for joining me, those who are here. My name is Kelly Palanti, and we've got another webinar coming up in about 9 minutes. But I want to just share briefly before I go some upcoming workshops that we have. We've got one that I do with my partner, Jamie Murphy. She'll be speaking next from Allendale Treatment. We do a mental health first aid certification. So you actually get a cert from that tells you that you're mentally health certified to give first aid. And then also we talk about workplace safety. So how to talk about, to take that mental health cert resources and bring that into the workplace and use that as a leader, use that as someone who's part of all staff. And really look at that as a resource, again, not only to support at work, but how are you supporting the whole employee for when they go home and use these resources as well. And then we've got another one special that's coming up just for the holidays. And this is from October 1st to December 15th. We're going to do workplace mental health and the holiday season. This is a short, just a half-day session, 4 hours that we do live or virtual. And I feel like it's really important that we're coming up. We know that there's a lot of suicide ideation. There's a lot of depression around the holidays, and this year should not be any exception. Even though that we're coming out of the pandemic, this is still something that happens normally around this time of the year. So offering this to employees, again, not only helps the bottom line of the company, but you're caring for the total employee and saying that you care about themselves, about them, about their coworkers, their family members, and their friends. Thank you so much. And again, we'll just take a quick pause here. We've got 8 minutes and we'll get on to our next speaker. Thank you so much for joining.